So hello everyone, very happy to be here today. I can probably remove that to speak. So I'm happy to introduce this panel that we have organized with Mohammed and Cody on the limits and merits of user study pre-registration. And we're going to look at this research in particular. So the whole thing we're going to talk about obviously is pre-registration. Quick introduction to what it is. The idea is that you register before you conduct data collection or data analysis. You register what you're going to do with it to force some transparency on your reporting later on. There's been a lot of work on pre-registration, their benefits, how they work, when they don't work, how you can hack them sometimes. There's been really a lot of work on this, including some in our community. You might recognize this paper from Andy Coburn that was presented at CHI, I think in 2018. And we've done also some work on the threats of a replication crisis in empirical computer science with Andy and others to try and show that, well, there are threats also in our community, and pre-registration is one of the things that could help limit these threats. But pre-registration doesn't necessarily apply to all works equally. For instance, conducting an interview and doing qualitative data analysis might be a bit more complicated to pre-register. And this is something that we do a lot in the Viz community, right? We don't only have very heavy quantitative work. And so this is something that we started thinking about. And we had even more feedback on this last year when we did this paper on registered report, which is another form of registration, with some people from the Viz community, and people voiced a lot of concern that it might not apply to the kind of research that they're doing. So based on this, we decided, okay, maybe it would actually be nice to discuss how pre-registration could work for our research, when it works, when it doesn't work, what are some of the issues that we might face. And for that, I'm very happy to have three amazing panelists with us today. We have Brian Nosek from University of Virginia and the Center for Open Science. We have Tamarin Dehaven, I hope I pronounced that right, from Harris University. And we have, I guess she doesn't need introduction, but Mariah Mayer from Linköping University. So how this is going to work is just a short intro that I'm doing now for 5 minutes. Then each panelist is going to do a short presentation, 5 to 10 minutes. Then we're going to have discussions, so questions from you, the audience physically or online, and then get some people time to conclude on what all of this brought us. Some of the outcomes that we hope from this is that we will all get a better understanding of the potential limits of pre-registration for the whole of this research, hopefully, or at least a lot more than just for quantitative work, and maybe a small publication in some format that would summarize the points that we've made through this panel and some of the concerns or questions that have been raised. So with that, I'm going to leave the floor for Brian. He's going to be our first speaker. If you can maybe switch him on. Cool.
Thanks, Lonnie. I'm delighted to be here as part of this session and interested to hear what kind of discussion we can have about the role and limits and opportunities of pre-registration. As the first presenter, I'll just do a little bit of context setting about the concept of pre-registration and its intentions. Interest in it has emerged in a much broader discussion about how is it that we can improve the credibility of research so that we can maximize its trustworthiness and accelerate progress on discovering knowledge, solutions, and treatments in the variety of research activities that happen across the academy. And pre-registration itself is intended to tackle two of the major challenges for research credibility. The first is publication bias. Not everything that gets conducted in research gets published. There is a selection process that occurs both by individual researchers doing their work, deciding what to write up and report, and in the peer review and publication process, filtering things that are acceptable for publication or not for whatever reason. And it's well documented across areas of scholarship that that publication process is biased in what types of research it tends to accept. More likely to accept positive than negative results, neat and tidy results compared to results that are messy, and novel findings as compared to replications. And a consequence of that selectivity bias is that the resulting literature is an exaggerated view of what the actual literature is, what research has been conducted. It looks more exciting, it shows larger effect sizes, and it's cleaner than the reality. leading to lower credibility of the overall literature and a misunderstanding of what the actual evidence suggests. So the role for pre-registration in this context is that if each study that I'm going to do in my lab is registered, where I commit to these are the experiments or studies that I'm going to do, then even if not all of them end up in the papers that come out of my lab, the rest of them are in principle discoverable, so that there are opportunities, mechanisms to correct for publication bias and to understand what the total literature is in comparison to the published literature. So that's solution one that pre-registration aims to address. Issue number two is trying to understand the relationship and the different inference processes that we apply to planned versus unplanned research. Pre-registration provides an opportunity to be very clear about what the plans were before the outcomes of the research were observed versus what things were discovered after the fact, perhaps interactively with the data itself. And this distinction has a number of different rationales and reasons that it may provide some increase in credibility to the work. A key challenge is that our statistical inferences in quantitative research applications are often dependent on a priori definition of those statistical tests, rather than have those tests be a consequence or determined interactively while we are examining the data. For those types of research applications, the act of pre-registration provides an opportunity to be very clear about which things were planned before observing the data and which things occurred as the researcher was interacting with the data. And providing that distinctiveness allows one to draw more credible statistical inferences on the planned work, often called confirmatory types of testing, and provide appropriate levels of uncertainty to those things that were unplanned and discovered after the fact, done interactively with the data. Both of these modes of research, planned and unplanned research or confirmatory versus exploratory types of research, are vitally important to the research process. We have things that we plan to do, the reasons that we do studies in the first place, and we have things that we learn as we're doing the work and discover unexpectedly in the context of the data. But pre-registration provides that opportunity to be very clear about which is which, so that we can calibrate our confidence and clarify what are the appropriate next steps for reducing uncertainty in the process. So those are the two key value propositions for why it is pre-registration might be useful as a general tool across a variety of different research applications. What has happened over the last several years is, as pre-registration has been adopted in different fields, there's been a real interesting exploration of its boundary conditions. What types of methodologies is it appropriate to be used for? Where does it provide value? And what are the costs and benefits of doing pre-registration? Superficially, it feels like, oh, that seems like a lot of extra work to do all of that planning before I even have access to the data. But in many contexts, it's just moving that process of doing that work forward in time, and also providing an opportunity to strengthen the plans so that the research that's ultimately done is stronger and more likely to be publishable regardless of outcome, as compared to a relatively unplanned or chaotic approach to doing research practice. There's also a lot of interesting technical innovations occurring to create different formats and test and evaluate different formats of pre-registration that are tuned to the specifics of a particular methodology or area of practice, and also in trying to connect pre-registration to the rest of the research lifecycle, making it easy, for example, for researchers to report the outcomes of research as it happens in their pre-registration, or to update their pre-registrations when things change, as they almost inevitably do during the conduct of research. So the point of pre-registration in that context is not to disallow researchers from adapting as the research process demands it, but rather to help report transparently when those changes are made, why they are made, so that the researchers themselves and the readers of that research can understand the decision process, understand the rationales for it, and update their confidence in that work accordingly. So I'm very interested to hear the other presentations and then engage in some discussion about how these might practically be applied in the context of the work that you are doing. So thanks very much for the invitation, and I'll hand it off to Tamarinda.
All right, thanks a lot, Brian. Can I get any feedback from the room if you can see and hear me clearly? Yes. Wonderful, thank you. Good afternoon from Berlin. I'm delighted to continue the conversation on pre-registration, and I'll focus on qualitative research, but I want to start off by emphasizing that some of the work I'll be presenting today is not done by me alone, and that I benefited from very knowledgeable and helpful co-authors that you see on the screen here. So I will focus on pre-registration for a broad group of methodologies generally referred to as qualitative research. And qualitative research aims to answer the how, why, and what type of questions of a phenomenon. And it often uses language as its data, be it written or oral, but it may also use photos, videos, visuals, or other types of behavioral recordings. And it can then be collected through more traditional methods, say interviews or focus groups, or a whole variety of more creative methods. And in its investigation, it tries to reveal the perspectives often of the subject, or say the patients, that the research question regards. And it uses an emergent design therein, referring to the iterative process of combining data collection, data analysis, data inspection, and design. And one of the reasons why we talk about pre-registration, also in the context of qualitative research, are of course these ideas that it may help boost the credibility and transparency of the work by giving some sort of a structured insight into how a study was designed and set up, and also see what sort of choices were made, and especially those along the way. And we are currently in a landscape where I think the importance of pre-registration is increasingly recognized by different stakeholders, and I'm also thinking about, say, journals or disciplinary organizations and funders. And this may be a good point to maybe sit back and pause a little, because generally speaking, this is a point where people say, but isn't pre-registering qualitative research inherently counterintuitive? Qualitative research very often operates on this very exploratory logic. Is that really useful? And I will defend the view that pre-registering qualitative research may indeed seem counterintuitive, but its usefulness may extend more widely than is immediately apparent. So for one thing, it may be helpful for parts of qualitative research that do involve an element of testing. But it can also bring greater clarity to research that operates on a more iterative or exploratory logic. Because even when exploring, scholars usually bring prior knowledge and preconceptions to a particular phenomenon they study. And in that sense, the pre-registration may help clarify, when you see the actual findings, which of those really drew on the initial beliefs and expectations and existing knowledge, and which very much diverged from those. And when I started this work back in late 2019, there were already different authors, including myself, that had put forth ideas of what would a qualitative pre-registration form then look like, what should you ask and investigate. But there hadn't really been any involvement with the community of qualitative researchers. And this is what we tried to do by means of a Delphi study. And a Delphi study, very briefly, consists of consecutive questionnaires with feedback reports in between. And you can reach out to an otherwise dispersed group, very analogous to survey research. And perhaps in comparison to more traditional in-person consensus-making methods, you don't have one person that can dominate, because people can fill this out anonymously and in their own time. You can see an overview of our design on this slide here, We had a preparatory phase and then 2 rounds where participants rated and gave feedback on our various proposals to be incorporated in a qualitative pre-registration form. This is an example of what such a process looks like. You can see that for round 1, we had proposed a term called sampling strategy. And then we got a lot of feedback, and just selectively highlighted a few here, of people being very confused. Sampling, isn't that quantitative? If we're talking more in the qualitative realm, don't you mean case selection? So in the next iteration, we thought we now got it right. We went for case selection strategy. And then we learned from our participants, no, actually, it is something else to sample, which can be understood if you give a good elaboration. But within your sample, you may still select particular cases to hone in on and to really focus. So in the final item, for example, you can see those two come apart. The outcome of this work was that in collaboration with the Open Science Framework, this form is now available if you go on their platform and you want to pre-register. It is an agreement-based form for qualitative pre-registration, and it's pivotal to assure that, you know, the strength of qualitative research, which in my view is precisely its ability to adapt, adjust, and respond, is not lost in pre-registration. And I think it need not be, because pre-registration is ultimately a plan and it's not a prison. I'd also like to emphasize that the use of this form is, of course, voluntary, and that the pre-registration should provide a systematic starting point before you go with your logbook into the field. And really, especially in qualitative research, it requires a certain level of updating to see how the study evolves. There are currently, I checked this last week, over 500 qualitative studies already pre-registered, or at least people have labeled them as qualitative studies. So should you be interested in this, you might want to have a look at these. And I wanted to take the last few minutes of my talk to reflect a little bit on when I think pre-registration is and is not useful, in particular when it comes to qualitative research. And my stance will be that this depends first and foremost on one's research paradigm. And with a paradigm, I mean a worldview. And this worldview is important because it is guiding how we view reality and how we view knowledge. And I'm going to draw very heavily on a chapter by Lincoln and Guba from 1994, two very famous qualitative researchers, where they put side by side 4 broad research paradigms, and they specify their connected ontologies and epistemologies. So ontologies describe the beliefs that we have about reality, and the epistemologies describe the very connected beliefs about knowledge, meaning what can be known about reality. First, in their overview, we have positivism. And positivism is the belief that there's an understandable reality out there that exists, and that's determined by natural laws and mechanisms. And science could, in principle, identify these natural laws and mechanisms. They are apprehendable. And when it comes to gathering views about reality, knowledge about reality, the researcher and the phenomenon they want to gather knowledge about are taken to be independent. This is what meant with a dualist. The researcher is looking at the world through a sort of one-way mirror, and it's not influencing the phenomenon they've studied. And it's very much from this paradigm also that the belief is that if findings are replicated, they're considered to be true. Then there's post-positivism, and that's justifiable because it arose to rebut some critiques to positivism. And here it is the belief that, yes, there is a reality out there, but we might never fully understand it because of our flawed human abilities and also the fundamentally hard to control nature of reality. So here objectivity comes in gathering knowledge, and it remains sort of ideal, but you get much more to a sort of probabilistic view of reality. Replicated findings are probably true. And then there is the critical theory, and the atoll is very deliberate here. You also have various feminist approaches, for example, that fall underneath this. And here reality is taken to be one's plastic, deeply shaped by history. And when we, it's then crystallized into something that we mistakenly call the truth. And here the researcher and the phenomenon they're investigating are thought to be deeply, deeply connected. What your values are as a researcher will inevitably influence what we can know about the phenomenon. And as it becomes, knowledge from a very particular individual about a very particular phenomenon. Then finally, we have constructivism, and that's a little bit more relativist about knowledge or about reality. It believes that multiple apprehendable social realities exist and that they are the products of human intellect. And because that is so, they may change. And knowledge then becomes something that doesn't just exist about reality, but rather that is created in interaction between the researcher and the phenomenon of interest. Then, as you will most likely already feel and know, from these ontologies and epistemologies also arise criteria for what is considered good research. And I take it that many of you are familiar with validity and reliability from positivism and post-positivism. Some of you may also be familiar with the more qualitative equivalents, such as confirmability or constructivism. But for example, in critical theory, where the focus is really on how reality was formed and shaped by its history, it's the historical situatedness of the inquiry that determines the goodness of it. And maybe also the ability of the inquiry to show what sort of hidden structures there are and to move the researchers or the readers of the knowledge into action. And coming back to saying why I think it really depends on your paradigm, I think if you situate your research maybe somewhere here in between positivism and post-positivism, pre-registration may be regarded desirable. However, if your research finds itself purely in a sort of more critical theory guarded paradigm, it might not feel so useful to you because there might be other things that you find so much more important about your work. And if your research finds itself more here, there may be situations where you think this is very desirable. And there may also be particular projects where you feel a little bit more uncertain. And I hope that we can discuss this a little bit further also throughout the panel. And I'll close with briefly highlighting the two works where we explain in particular why pre-registering quantitative research might be useful and also how it can be done. And then I'll pass it on to Mariah. Thank you very much.
Okay, where's my... Wonderful, thanks. So my name is Mariah Meyer, and I'm really excited about this panel. And so thanks, Lonnie and Cody, for inviting me. I am decidedly nowhere near an expert or even that knowledgeable about pre-registration. And so this has been a great opportunity to get to learn about this. Brian and Tamarin, like both of your talks were wonderful. And I think what I've put together is going to sort of build off of some of these ideas. So thanks so much for setting up my arguments so nicely. So Lonnie and I have had many discussions around ideas for pre-registration, but also around reproducibility and replicability more broadly. And based upon those discussions, I'm going to present the dissenting view or the case against pre-registration. And so even though I'm going to argue against it, I really want to be very clear. I'm arguing against it for some visualization research. I think that there is definitely value for what other communities have really done as far as paving the way for helping make research more reproducible and replicable. But that's not what I'm talking about today. Okay, but before I sort of present my case against, I just want to contextualize the arguments I'm going to make first. So I first want to start with the idea that we in the Viz community, I argue, are not just quant and qual. And when we talk about the ideas behind reproducibility, we're often doing so with a discussion of this binary distinction of there's quant Viz research and there's qual Viz research. But one of the arguments I want to make today is that we are, in my perspective, we are not this binary community. Instead, we have a very rich and diverse landscape of research approaches, and I think Tamarin really set this up really nicely. But I think one of a major aspect of our community is a strong design presence. And I mean design both from a design research perspective, but also from engineering design. We have a lot of really important work that continues to be done that pulls from design and reflective practices more broadly, things like design studies, systems design, theory development, and so on. And I think that these kinds of perspectives on research add yet a whole different set of considerations when we talk about knowledge. And again, Tamarin set this up really nicely. But I think that the diversity of our community is often flattened when we sort of shunt a lot of the research that's not quantitative under this label of qualitative. So the first point I want to make is I don't think we are just quant and qual. I think we are a much more diverse community than that. And so I don't have a good way to describe, to come up with a different binary, which is probably not what I should be doing, but I often think about it as work that is empirical in nature versus that which is not. So the second point I want to make is that I think replication, which is, a lot of the motivations behind pre-registration, is really important for positivist approaches to knowledge. It's as what has already been stated, it's replication of results that scientists are able to build up a case for validity, which is the thing that sort of lets us know how truthful or representative a reality a finding is. But we do have a lot of research that is conducted from other epistemological stances, other ways of thinking about knowledge and how it comes to be. And so, for example, in the 80s, as social scientists were working to gain credibility for some of the more descriptive and detailed research that was emerging, a lot of methodologists began questioning the assumptions of this objective, neutral view of knowledge making. And I'm going to cite same authors that Tamarin was citing here, Lincoln and Guba. And it was back in the mid-'80s that they proposed a really radically different interpretivist and constructivist lens from which to judge the quality and rigor of this kind of work. And they had this proposal of trustworthiness, which represented a really different set of criteria and values from that of validity and generalizability and objectivity that is really the bedrock of most scientific approaches. And so building on this work and from other types of work in social sciences, humanities, and design, a couple years ago, Jason Dykes and I proposed an interpretivist view of design study and a sort of new set of criteria for evaluating the rigor. And I'm not going to go into the details of that work here, but I just want to say that our ideas in that work really built from the underlying argument that design studies are inherently non-reproducible and actually misaligned with positivist views of knowledge. And so I'm just bringing up this work as an example of visualization research where I think a desire for replication is actually completely out of scope. Okay, and so actually getting to the point of this panel, here I want to argue that pre-registration can actually be harmful, maybe. Sometimes. So I took a look at some of the templates for pre-registration in order to think about what it might look like to pre-register, for example, a visualization design study. And even though I'm going to focus on design study, which is the thing that I feel confident to talk about, I speculate that these kinds of arguments hold for other kinds of design-oriented work in the community. So for example, I looked at a template that was linked off of the Center for Open Science website that was for qualitative work. And in fact, it might have been the one that Tamarin was talking about. I chose qualitative work because there wasn't anything for, say, design-oriented research. Some of the questions that were asked in the template were, pretty straightforward things I felt I could answer about a design study, albeit with language that seemed kind of ill-fitting. So it was things like, describe your research aims. I might say something like, well, I'm going to develop a visual analysis tool for field X. Things about sampling strategy, which in the case of design study would be, I'm going to work with a handful of collaborators. And also things like stopping criteria, which for us is often the successful deployment of a tool. And I think these are really good considerations to think through at the start of a design study to ensure that we're sufficiently planning, but they don't actually serve the purpose that pre-registration was meant to serve, which is namely this idea of avoiding of cherry picking of results and analysis approaches. And so, in fact, in design study, we are always reflecting and interpreting, and we learn along the way. In the design process, we learn through the process of design, and that informs what we decide to do next. Because design is dynamic, it's fluid, it's impossible to predict, and so part of what we're supposed to do is adjust our processes as we go. And so, in fact, we've also argued that the sign of a good design study is one that actually shifts and changes the fundamental problem that we're trying to solve. And so in our original definition of design study, we proposed that one of the signs of success is where you actually go up and down along the task clarity axis. That as we strive through prototypes and conversations to crispen up what the task is we're designing for, that actually makes the task change and fuzzes it, and then we have to start over. And that this back and forth is a sign of a successful design study because we're disrupting the work of the people that we're collaborating with. And this is the kind of influence that is actually the opposite of what pre-registration aims for. But beyond this misalignment with values and goals, I want to argue that calling for pre-registration for non-empirical or design-oriented viz research is actually harmful from a perspective of power. By asking studies that do not abide by the values and positions of positivist inquiry, we are in fact by asking studies that don't abide by those values to actually abide by those values, we're giving power and authority to one way of knowing over others. Okay, which brings me to my last point, which is that as a methodologically diverse community, we need similarly diverse research values, criteria, and guidelines. And I think some of our research can and does absolutely benefit from the work that's being done on replicability and reproducibility in other fields. And I think pre-registration for positivist-oriented studies may really well benefit our community. But for other approaches, how we're going to make our research transparent and scrutinizable is an open research question. And furthermore, approaches that are characterized by a creative, flexible, messy, subjective, multifaceted process is going to require it's going to require us to leave room for researchers to experiment and be creative with how to best make their research processes accessible. So, for example, we've actually been recently working on an idea that we call traceability, which is about making legible the relationship between the design process, the results, and our final reports. This is work that is being headed up by a student in our group, Jen Rogers, who's here and is in collaboration with Alex Lex. And Jen's been experimenting with how we can support the traceability of research results with technology. And she's developed a really cool prototype that allows a researcher to record artifacts as evidence during a design study, to then thread those artifacts together to capture the doing and learning that led to a research insight, and to then link directly to those threads with deep links in our research reports. And while I think that this is really cool work, it is just one experiment in how we can report on our messy subjective design processes in ways that is scrutinizable. And I think the community is still a long, long way from standards and good examples of how to report this kind of work in transparent ways. And so, really quick, these were the sort of points I was building up. And I just wanted to really quickly comment on two things from the previous two talks that I don't know how to answer, but I would be really excited to talk through. Brian brought up this idea of the publication bias issue, the sort of bloated notion of publications that we have. And I have had these kinds of conversations for the sort of work that design-oriented work as well. Like, just because we do a lot of design work in a design study, does that mean we should get a publication? I think this is a really difficult question to answer, and apparently was something that was talked about in the application panel yesterday. But I don't know what are good mechanisms for us to grapple with that and think through it. And then Tamarin mentioned this notion of pre-registration being a systematic starting point. And I think that when it comes to design-oriented work, I'm really curious what the benefits might be for design and what are the important aspects for planning that are non-restrictive but can help scaffold design processes. I don't have a good answer for that, but I think it's a compelling question to think about. So I'll stop there. Thanks.
Thank you, Mariah. Thank you, everyone, for the presentation. So there's been a lot of questions on Slido that are being reported also on the Discord. I think we can try to tackle some of them. Whatever happens, what we will do is that we will answer each and every one of them later. If we don't have time to go through this, I will go through them. And because I know some stuff is more practical things that I can probably answer to in terms of quantitative research cases that have been asked. Maybe Brian, Darren, do you have any comments based on Mariah's last presentation, which might be a little bit provocative for good reasons?
I'll just say I thought it was excellent. And what I think Mariah closed with is really highlighting what the broader goal is that I think is shared regardless of orientation, which is the value of transparency. And really, that's fundamentally what role pre-registration serves, is to make clear the process of getting to whatever conclusions were ultimately made in the research. And it, as a tool for that, has potential broad use, but also potential limited use. And I think, I'm not in this this field, so I can't speak to, I disagree about this and this, and this is how it would be applied. But what I really appreciate in the presentation was wrestling with some broader principles and trying to determine, is this particular tool fit for purpose or not? And if not, what are other mechanisms we might pursue to improve the transparency of our research processes to make them more valuable and accessible by others? So I loved it.
Any point from you, Tamarin, or?
I very much agree. And I think it's nice that we had some similar authors, although we didn't coordinate this. So it's nice to know that they're in the room or in the background somehow. I wanted to maybe say two things with regards to the point of there maybe not being a precise hypothesis already at the start. And the second thing, that the flexibility would make it impossible to meaningfully pre-register something, in particular when even the setup of the whole design of a study may change. So I think that sort of first objection of there not being a predefined hypothesis may indeed to disqualify the use of pre-registration for the mere purpose of, clarifying expectations from things that were more sort of iteratively discovered along the way. But I think part of the use of pre-registration, which also resonated with the point that Mariah brought on later, of making something transparent and putting the study design and plan on an open platform for the community to scrutinize, even when there are no sort of hypotheses to test and to pre-register, a study always has aims and always reasons to do a study. And I think in the sort of more qualitative work that I also do, we often start our data collection, at least with sort of some ideas of the topics that are going to be relevant. And it has helped me, and also in teaching my students, very much to spell those out. But surely by its nature, much of qualitative research has this sort of higher degree of freedom. It's not bound by some sort of limitations there. But I think that sort of doesn't exempt us from the duty we have as a researcher to really maximize transparency and to make it clear to our readers and maybe the users of our work how we got to a particular outcome. And the second point on the flexibility, I think, again, it's a little bit tricky, and it may apply in some cases, but I think for a starter, even in quantitative research, we might often find the case that we've planned something all out perfectly, And then it turns out your method and your way are just not going to work. COVID comes, something else comes. And I think also in quantitative research in particular, it may very much be the case that the initial design is not exactly the same design that is reported when written up the study. And that should be seen as a good thing. I would be a little bit worried if someone pre-registers their qualitative work and then they report the exact same thing in the study. I would almost feel like, what, have they not learned? Have they not taken anything on board there? So I really think we may be more aligned there than we initially made it seem, in particular when you talk later about, the traceability and trying to also update our work to see how our work evolves precisely by doing. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. I guess we can start taking some of the questions that we have from Slido. I think what is interesting and also reflects the diversity of research that we have at this conference is, let me find it again. It was somewhere here. Yes, is pre-registration relevant for non-human subject evaluations? And I think this person says, for example, running a new algorithm against a standard metric or data set to evaluate or compare efficiency or runtime, is it something we can pre-register? So often in our community, we build these new systems or technique and we try to evaluate them on some specific data set. I would say that this is something we could pre-register in a way. We could just say, I plan to test my new system, technique, algorithm, whatever it is, on this data set and measure these outcomes. And it's fine if we then explore more or do something else, as long as we transparently report that our initial plan was to test on this. I think this is something that could work for the community. Do you have any objections to that in the audience or online?
I don't want to speak for I don't want to speak for the case for the pre-registration of that, because I think other folks on the panel could describe better what it might mean to actually pre-register something that isn't about people. I suspect, like you, that it makes sense. The thing that I would want to bring up here, though, is that even though, let's say you're designing some, this isn't always the case, but we have a lot of people who are designing like new systems and techniques and libraries and things. And even though the technical artifact is an outcome that perhaps can benefit from some of these positivist ideas of evaluation, we very often in that kind of research, also it comes along with a bunch of insights or implications or things that were learned along the way in the process of designing these types of things. And that's the part that I'm really interested in and think that is an open question, is those are also considered contribution and new knowledge to our community. And how do we go about scrutinizing those new knowledge claims? How do we go about making where they came from transparent? And that's where I think some of that work can weed into really new and different kind of territory beyond thinking about just the technical artifact as the only contribution or knowledge that's coming out of these kinds of studies.
Any points from you folks online? Yeah, Ryan?
I'll just add to that the latter point that Mariah was making, I think, is true across all research traditions that I'm familiar with, which is a whole lot of stuff is learned after the fact, even with pre-registration. My lab pre-registers everything that it does, and I can be confident that no study has ever proceeded exactly as the pre-registration, building on Tamarinda's point. We always have to report deviations of different kinds, given the reality of what happened. And then no paper ends up just saying, and here's the outcomes from what we pre-registered. We always have, and here's all these weird twists and turns that emerged. And here's all this interesting stuff that happened that was not expected. Or here's this weird outlier that's sending us in a totally different direction from what our initial thoughts were. And that is the generative side of research that is productive, exciting, path-breaking, but also more uncertain. And that's the part that for us, the role of pre-registration really has its benefit, is just to clarify that discovery process and to say, those were really interesting, but given how we know about how the world operates, we're going to be a little more cautious about those initial things and suggest them as needing more interrogation, more follow-up, more investigation, as opposed to some of the things that are just tests of what we planned, which we may be more willing to draw stronger inference from right at the outset.
Yeah, that's, Brian, I think that's such an interesting point. And, some of the work that we've been doing recently in our group, and Jen Rogers, who I'd mentioned before, has been doing work on traceability. We've really been thinking a lot about how do we capture the design process throughout this very messy process that can sometimes take 2 or 3 years to do. Memoing, for example, has been something that we've been really trying to do a lot of. And this idea that what you're saying, pre-registration or something like that as a way to capture where you start to help you better articulate and reflect on and see how you've changed, I think is a really interesting idea to help that kind of reflective process, which I think as a community, we struggle with how to document and also how to just support. And I think that's a really interesting idea.
Can I add something to this briefly?
Sure.
I think it's also very important that it also has to do with the way our research is maybe valued and evaluated also, where part of that whole process that we're now seeking to trace was sometimes, either not really shared or shared in a very fuzzy way, whereas so much effort and work of science and really brilliant research is done in that very moment, in the doing of, and not just in the reporting of a very polished story. So I think it also has to do with a sort of shift that we're currently witnessing in research, where other aspects of our research, and not just the one sort of standard paper outcome, at least in my field, tend to be valued, and that we're also looking for good ways to make those apparent so they can be acknowledged as legitimate products that people have worked on very hard.
I think on Discord, Melanie Tori also wrote an interesting point. I don't know if you want to say out loud, but there are alternative ways to be transparent in research besides pre-registration. In many qualitative methodologies, the vehicle to transparency is through the writing of the paper itself, where we build credibility through the notion of thick description, providing enough details, quotes, examples, vignettes, reflections, that the reader can make up their own mind of whether or not to trust the author's conclusion from the work. And I think this speaks to maybe like how pre-registration might not suit this kind of work necessarily, but one counterpoint I could give to this is I'm not sure research papers are the right vehicle for that either very often because of the limited space you have, right? I mean, you submit a 9-page paper because there's a page limit, and how can you make sure, and I mean, this is something we talked about with Mariah a little bit before, how can you make sure that a paper will contain enough details? I mean, of course, there's supplemental materials, but yeah, go ahead.
So I have to answer, because where would you suggest that all of these social scientists who do qualitative research publish their work, right? I mean, they go into research papers. Sure, they could also go into books. That gives you a more extended format to do this kind of research. But I think, for me in this community, I want to encourage a diversity of kinds of contributions. And that includes these types of papers that are more qualitative, that come from different philosophical perspectives on research. And to do that, we need to find inclusive ways to make them feel comfortable and welcome in this community.
Absolutely. To make that clear, I was not advocating against submitting this kind of work at all. I was just saying maybe the research papers that we have currently in their formats with their page limit are not the base vehicle for transparent reporting of some qualitative work, at least.
Yeah, and sort of building off this, and this is something that I wanted to ask Brian and Tamarind about too, and get their thoughts on, is that we're finding as we're trying to very thoughtfully work at improving the transparency of design-oriented work by capturing an abundant collection of artifacts, doing lots of memoing, again, these things, pointing to Jen's work. I mean, this is her whole dissertation work is experimenting in this. She's collecting hundreds of artifacts. And one of the things that's been very clear to us is that just by doing a huge dump of artifacts into supplemental materials on something like OSF is not really transparent. That work, it's completely inaccessible, it's completely unscrutinizable. Actually understanding how these artifacts can speak to how I got to some insight that I report in a paper is we don't think that static supplemental materials are how you do it. But then suddenly you're like, well, then, we've been thinking about building a tool. So now we have a piece of technology that with visualization that lets us have these research threads that are accessible. But this is technology that's built on a tech stack and is going to inevitably, Jen's going to graduate and get a job and move on with her life. This thing is going to die. Sorry, Jen, we've talked about this. It's eventually going to die. And so then what does that mean for our efforts to record our own research processes? So this sort of entanglement of how we actually make messy evidence scrutinizable by using technology then has the downside of now the technology is going to die. And anyway, we don't know how to handle this. And I'm sort of curious, Brian and Tamara, what you think, because in our mind, static dumps of supplemental material is it's not going to work. It's not going to work.
Yeah, this is a great and hard problem. Our original conception of OSF was that what we would create is an ability to sort of replay the movie of how the research was done. So it creates, as you go, sort of this is what's happening in the process. And then any reader gets to go and hit rewind and play and see it all happen. That's easy to say and very, very hard to do because of exactly the issues that you describe, which are research is super complicated. How do you have an adaptive, flexible tool that allows that? And the actual information of robust research activity is really complex. And the perceiver doesn't actually need all of it. They need the right parts of it. But how do we decide what the right parts are? How do we put it into some kind of narrative or interpretable or understandable form so that we can deliver the information that a perceiver needs in a way that's efficient, effective, and impactful for giving them the ability to engage with the outcomes, the interpretation, the analysis, whatever it is that they're going to do with that work. And I think this is one of the long strands of what this entire process is moving toward in improving research activity. Pre-registration and output sharing are blunt instruments, right? Here it is. Do something with it, reader. But the real dynamism is where the action will be, I think, in really improving that dialogue between the doer and the perceiver of the research. Sorry, Tamara.
I'm feeling slightly optimistic about this discussion. And I think the fact that we're seeing various technologies being developed, or in some way or another trying to, get the reader to almost be a little bit more in the lab or in the design process by rewinding, as Brian said. And we're seeing all sorts of things happening here with people trying to sort of connect all their different research outputs better. I'm thinking about platforms like Research Equals that are designed here in Berlin. There's also various people around the world that try to sort of import the technologies from tools like GitHub to almost connect them with other tools like OSF. And to some extent, that may be we may at this point be in the era where we almost have the technology overload, but I'm very interested in going to see which of those products are going to be survived and maintained. And I think it's also interesting in this regard, although I completely understand Mariah and Jane, that there's something very worrying about them not knowing where is this beautiful thing that I'm developing ultimately going to end up. One of the things that makes me rather optimistic about this sort of thing is also that we see the attention from many different stakeholders in the research process. We see the interest in these sort of things there. And I will just speak on behalf of myself, but I think there are other key players in the whole research ecosystem that might have more money and financial resources to put them towards the sort of technological sustainability of the kind of tools that are currently being developed and will be developed later. At least that's what I'm hoping for.
Time for something that I think might help us in defining and maybe pushing for right practices when they matter. Someone is asking, are there guidelines we can create around whether pre-registration is recommended or necessary that are simple enough for authors and reviewers to understand? Because once you bring in research paradigms, it might be a bit complicated for many people. So can we think, and I think there was another question along these lines. So I think this is something that's interesting to address or comment on maybe here. Like, do you think there's a way to kind of describe the research that we do for individualization community in simple enough terms and link it to the potential need for pre-registration beyond the obvious quantitative analysis is likely to benefit it?
I guess also it's directed at me as the token.
Not just that,
the token
also to
person.
everyone.
Yeah, I'd love to hear other ideas on this too. I mean, I don't have a satisfying answer because I think the problem goes back further, sort of, education. I mean, Lonnie and Cody, you're open practice chairs, and I think a really interesting part of that role could be to take on. I think you both have to some degree this idea of educating the community through recommendations and stuff. So I think we are making progress, but I think that as a community, like this whole realization that, there's different epistemologies out there and different ways to think about how knowledge comes to be and thus how we review it, is sort of new in this community. I find it super exciting and very generative and full of research possibilities. But I think that the community is going to take a while to understand and appreciate that. And we need training. I was trained as a computer scientist, and I didn't take any sort of ways of knowing course. I came to this later in life, and I think other fields do a better job of this. I think there was I don't even remember. I saw some talk here this week where someone was commenting how people who do qualitative social science work generally always have some training in quantitative methods, but people who predominantly do quantitative methods rarely have training in qualitative methods. And so, there's this kind of thing, which I might argue goes back to these, sort of power structures that we have. And okay, it's getting rambly, but for me, I think that there's just education that the community still needs. I think conversations like this that you've organized are wonderful opportunities to sort of put these ideas out there. But these are big, difficult concepts. I've had to read for years and years and years to wrap my head around this. And, we're already asking our graduate students to be good engineers, good study designers, good collaborators, good designers, and now they have to also be theorists. It's a lot. I don't know, Brian and Tamron, if you can speak from your experiences with other communities.
I'm going to go first and say that one of my part of my background is in philosophy, so I'm always yaying when people think, yes, we should talk more about ways of knowing. But that aside, two ways or two sets of terms that I frequently hear being thrown around, and whether this is meaningful or maybe not so much, that I also use when educating my students. The first, of course, being, is it exploratory or confirmatory research? Where confirmatory would more maybe be, we have seen some of those very, very interesting artifacts. They really provoked a lot of thought. And now we want to go down this rabbit hole and get back with a little bit more certainty of whether this is worth exploring or maybe recommending to others. Whereas the exploratory would be more towards this is something new that we want to see, and we're almost just sort of fishing to see what is there and what would be worth following up on. So that being the sort of most frequently thrown around distinction that I could think of. A more technical one might have to do with, whether the sort of time difference between where you present, this is my hypothesis, this is what I want to test, versus when the phenomenon occurs. Where it would be, if you can actually in advance say, this is what I want to do and test, and I can formulate very clearly, and I can then create for the conditions to examine that, then it sounds like pre-registration would be a great thing for you. And if it's, technically or in some way completely infeasible to do that, so you can only sort of draw your inferences about reality after you've already observed something, then it might not be so useful from the start. So their sort of distinctive point is more with the sort of time when the phenomenon occurs. So I'm hoping those two thoughts are potentially helpful for the asker of the question.
Yeah, just to add to those points, it's a great question, because it would be very interesting to see if we could outline a set of principles that I think would be quite general, that would help to determine under what conditions pre-registration actually provides benefit rather than just cost or is irrelevant. The additions that, or maybe they're just rephrasings of some of the things Mariah and Tamarind already said, are to ask oneself, are there benefits for planning? If there are benefits for planning, then pre-registration may have a role in just a structured process for planning what the work is going to be, and then have some documentation of that. That may be a weird and small way, but it actually is a relevant one for thinking about what purpose pre-registration can serve. A second is we're concerned about bias in lots of different areas of methodology. The particular way pre-registration might help with bias is to ask oneself, is there potential for bias where pre-commitment would have some mitigating effect on that bias, either by increasing accountability, by just offering transparency of what those positionalities or other types of orientations are, laying those out in advance, or other mechanisms in which that could prevent or reveal bias as it plays out. Right? I said I'm going in to do this thing, but then I reported on this thing. Wait a second, why'd you change here? That gives me some occasion to reflect on why that might have shifted. And then the last would be, does it matter for the doer or the observer of the research to understand the origins of the work? Is that relevant for the interpretation in some general way, either in confidence of it, just to understand what it is, to actually interpret the outcomes as they are? But those are just initial thoughts, just like Timon.
Okay, so we have a lot more questions on the Discord/Slido. I don't think we'll have time to go through this, so we'll just probably give some time to the panelists to give some concluding remarks. Before that happens, I want to say that lots of the questions that have been asked are very interesting, and I think we should continue reflecting on this. If you want to be part of this conversation of pre-registration/being transparent to your readers and want to contribute to like a fuller, more complicated conversation about this, shoot me an email. I'll be more than happy to create a Slack or anything where you can continue this conversation. Meet every now and then, maybe digitally, and maybe work towards something that like we could start thinking about in the VIS community, to have something that would not discriminate against any kind of research that we have, and also try to solve some of their inner problems actually in terms of reporting. So yeah, feel free to shoot me an email. And I'd be more than happy to include it in these conversations. I've seen lots of things about, fear that pre-registration, if it was adopted at VIS officially for some research, then reviewers might always expect it, and that there would be potential harmful sides of this. And that's very true. And I think we should be careful of that as well. But yeah, I'll be more than happy to include you in conversations and to start a broader community conversation that will include every researcher in the community. So concluding remarks in any kind of order, maybe reverse order. Mariah, do you want to go first?
I should have taken notes or something. Just that I have to say I'm leaving this panel with much more hope than I perhaps had come into it. And I want to thank you, Tamarind and Brian. Like, it was really nice to hear you speaking on these topics. And I think that, you know, the points about the benefits of planning is really interesting. This idea of the publication bias, I think, really transcends our community as well. But I think like taking pre-registration, you know, for the Viz community, I think it would require taking something like pre-registration away from the positivist, the singular sort of positivist origins of replication. If we can move away from that being the only thing, but being one of multiple benefits of it, I think that that could provide some really interesting opportunities as a community to think about how we can make our work more transparent and scrutinizable, which I think is an important endeavor for us.
I will maybe end then on my own, maybe slightly provocative ways, in saying that sometimes when people learn about these things, they think it is some sort of wonderful proxy for quality, whatever research quality may be in your field. And I want to be very clear and say it is absolutely not. If anything, it's going to provide us greater insight in how poor quality work you have been doing or how excellent quality work you have been producing. But I want to be very, very clear that especially when we take these things broader and when we talk about discussions whether something is applicable to all, it often almost becomes a sort of denominator or a stamp of this is thus high quality work. And I think it is useful, and I think it is laying out those sort of things can help us to better understand quality, but it should never be equated with quality as such. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you so much for saying that. It was really important, I think, to hear.
Yeah, I'll affirm that, just noting that pre-registrations have occasionally revealed the poor quality of my work, which is humbling, but important, perhaps. This has been a really interesting conversation and great because I think what it is pushing on is this recognition that pre-registration as a concept has gained substantial purchase in the research community ahead of our understanding of how and when and how best it applies in various research contexts. And that raises reasonable and important concerns for ensuring that either its proper use gets localized to those domains where it's relevant, or in Mariah's final points there, that the concept gets elevated a level to be more inclusive of a wider variety of research methodologies than its origins, which were the primary origin is in a very simplistic, sounds pejorative context, but it's of experimental design where a researcher doesn't have the data yet and they go get the data and then they test quantitatively with standard statistical inference tools whether their hypotheses played out or not. So a very specific application then starts to have much broader potential effects on existing data, on qualitative research, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And because of its origins, may have things that are held on to, that are unnecessarily held on to, for actually making it a useful concept that could be applied more broadly and more effectively. And I think a lot of the traceability that Mariah brought up is an example of that. If we started from a very different tradition, the concept of pre-registration, we might have had a very different conception right from the outset. And so part of the dialogue here that I think, and I hope that this will promote, is to examine what are the broader goals of something like pre-registration, and is it possible to reform that concept to be fit for purpose for a more inclusive set of methodologies. And I'll just say that as a representative of the Center for Open Science here, and we maintain the open science framework, we would love to collaborate or receive input that is being generated in different communities for how it is the services be adapted, improved, or experimented with for different domains, right? So like Tamarita a fellowship with COS and developed that qualitative registration format. That's been so useful. She showed 500 something people have tried out and used that already. We're very delighted to work with other groups and communities and say, okay, let's throw the current conception out the window. Let's try a new conception, create a format, experiment with it in the community, and revise, and rise, and see if that ends up providing some value. So I'll end with that, just as gratitude for being part of it. Thank you.
Thanks everyone for this. I don't want to stand between you and your lunch or dinner, depending on time zones, for too long. So my email and Cody's email is on Discord. Feel free to reach out to us if you want to continue these conversations. I don't know in which format yet. This is something we can discuss first by email and then decide how we want to do this, what we want to do exactly, and what format to use. Thank you so much. Thanks. Let's thank our panelists maybe one time. But round of applause for everyone. Thank you so much for accepting the invitations. I'm very happy to work with you.
Thanks a lot. Bye-bye.